Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. We just hit 52,000 subscribers recently, and we're going to be looking at the history of Tartaria in the context of Antiquitech. This will sort of be an intro video for those who are not familiar with Tartaria or those who are newcomers to this sort of history. We're going to be looking first at India and at some of the palaces, some of the fortresses, some of the towers that are found in Agra, and then we're going to be connecting those with some other fortresses, some other buildings, some other Antiquitech that is found all along the other four corners of the earth. Basically, you can go to any ancient town and you can find these buildings that are nearly one and the same. And people hear, oh, these buildings are very similar. That's just how they built back then. But we're talking about geometrical patterns. We're talking about arches and domes. We're talking about underground passages, all constructed in a way that would indicate that these cultures were one and the same, because the mathematical properties and the measurements of these buildings are so unique, meaning that new structures and structures we make nowadays do not bear these measurements, and rarely do you find a building that is almost exactly the same as the next building, especially when we talk about building with steel and all the components that go into the interior and things like that. Yet when we look at old world buildings with domes, with minarets, with these different properties that come into play when we look in India, and then we'll connect it with parts of China and other parts of the Middle East, and then we'll look at North America. We'll really be looking at all around the world. We have parts of Africa I'll be diving into, and of course looking at the castles of Europe. This will be Tartary for Dummies, or Tartary, a beginner's guide to getting into this Antiquitech. And if you don't want to hear my narrative in this video, which is an opinion, meaning this is not agreed upon by science, more or less I'm pulling different parts of different hypotheses to connect them to make my overarching idea, which I believe aligns with many other people's idea about what Tartary is, or what Antiquitech is, what the architecture of the old world really is. So if you don't want to hear my opinion, you can pause the video here and now just enjoy this large collection of images. I would say probably 300 images or more, looking at this Antiquitech, specifically these buildings that seem to incorporate the same sort of architecture that are found on all parts of the world, that some date to BC times, while others will date to 2,000 years ago. Some will date to 1,000 years ago, and some will date to as recently as 100 or 150 years ago. But one thing we do not see is buildings like this being created in the last century. So we're going to get into that history. We're going to try and connect it all through the basis of simple deduction, basically looking at what we have and deducing what these buildings could be, or simply how they could all be so similar. So if you don't want to hear my opinion on how this is all done, pause the video, just enjoy these images, but we'll be getting right into it. So let's go. Much we may concern ourselves with about the old world, about our historical narrative, these endless questions that seemingly can't be answered through a simple analysis of the timeline, stems down to the overwhelmingly strong evidence that our past was, at one point or another, a rapidly growing manifestation of the best that the world had to offer, meaning it came from all walks of life. How fond the many diverse nations of the world must have been of one another to continuously utilize foreign architectural components, as well as foreign technology and even foreign idols in their domestic architecture. A prideful war monument? You usually see a victory pillar, or a massive arch, or even better, a statue of the most famous general of your land on a horse. We find these monuments on all the corners of the earth. Red bricks seem to be an abundant source worldwide as well. No exact chemical process is given for the ancient bricks that we find worldwide. We have different areas saying they were constructed out of different things, and yet they always turned out to be red bricks. No matter which isolated kingdom you can name, we can almost certainly find ancient architecture that incorporated the red brick. Where does it all tie back to? In India. In sites like this, we have the Elephant Tower in Agra, and then we also have the palaces far, far away that also incorporate not only the red brick, but the exact same geometrical properties as the palaces of Agra. To make this even more inconclusive, if you take bricks as a footnote, we must not forget the occasional accounts that tell us that a brick's distinct red color comes not from the elements that were incorporated naturally into the brick, but rather from the unnatural addition of blood, usually from the vanquished, as in the many castles that I've previously discussed in northern Haiti. Again, we see similarities that extend beyond what could be considered common coincidence, which itself I don't really believe in. And yet the mainstream timeline has dubious throwaway names, entities seemingly added to the history to convolute the timeline, and worst of all, the renaming or rebranding of the same people throughout history, i.e. calling the same group of people by different historically accepted names in different pockets of this history, compartmentalizing aspects of the narrative, which throughout time creates a divide in the understanding of the history as a whole. We see this done in every single narrative. For example, we see the great complexity when we discuss the historical people of Ethiopia and the history of ancient Libya. But one thing that never leaves us without a trace or a thread, or a small sliver of understanding to tug at, especially in our modern day research, is this architecture. At this point, in my old world understanding, I'm comfortable to discuss openly the unique structures, cities, built upon ancient mounds. The mounds themselves often mysterious, constructed at the conflux of two rivers or another inescapable marker on a route. These cities make up the greater parts of the most famous cities worldwide, with only a handful of the most populated cities today not having some sort of history that dates back to an indigenous or earlier group, which is credited with having built the earthworks, the mounds, the tells, and established some sort of trade at this infrastructure point. Atop these mounds, these ancient cities, towers, and places of worship were built, and they bloomed with castle or defensive walls that surrounded them. And in America, these were often labeled retaining walls or canal walls. The streets then were paved and laid with this cobblestone that we see in the oldest photographs. The buildings begin to rise around them, at least that's what we're told. And then by the time of photography, having seemingly reached their apex, these cities look like they've been abandoned. We find the same cities then in history, a few years later, even larger and more meticulously built, being the same ones that are the largest cities then in the world. But when they were first photographed, they appeared dated, empty, and cryptic in nature. I can show you, for example, a photograph from 1870 that was taken in my hometown, and they're pretty clear as day, yet modern historians and naysayers to this alternate history will argue that the cameras of such societies as Paris and Berlin and New York, etc., were just too slow. The cameras were too cumbersome to accurately depict the millions of people that were supposed to be in the population of these cities at that time. It's an appalling argument, really, but one that holds a candle with modern historians nonetheless. Yet, as technology appeared to switch hands in the Industrial Revolution, the same people who appeared to engineer the wireless trolleys, engineer the underground pneumatic tunnels, the sprawling kingdoms with fully automated transport, and the same kingdoms, the cities, the principalities, almost always were equipped with multiple working aqueducts, sewer systems that reach deep underground and above ground. You would see such antiquitech that was then labeled to be telegraph lines and other things of that nature. Yet these same cities, we're told, experienced rapid growth in the late 1800s. It doesn't matter which major city you pick, whether in America or really any part of the world, you'll find a period of rapid growth after the Industrial Revolution. This rapid growth seemed to show that substantial portions of the cities were already completed and even abandoned. And that's what we see in the earliest photographs. When we look at the mid-1800s in these large cities, we don't see any construction. What we see is a lot of aftermath of what would appear to be a cataclysm, a flooding event, or something else along those lines. Yet, we're told by the historians of 150 years ago that this is, quote, construction. But nowadays, we're smart enough to read between the lines. These same cities, we're told, experienced an industrial age, and that's what we're looking at in the earliest images. How convenient that after everything was finally built out is when the photographs would finally come to these cities. It's like a coincidence that we should not believe in. In my opinion, it appears as if this industrial age that we discuss of the mid to late 1800s actually slowed down or even regressed the cities of mankind, meaning in the earliest photographs in some of these cities before the industrial age, meaning before the railroad would reach these cities, before the cities were built out in steel, what we would see is massive, completed cities that don't appear to have a population, and they're built mostly out of brick and masonry. Then we're told these same cities that are photographed already experience the industrial age. They have trolleys and rail lines and other things brought into the city, and then they're photographed again in the more famous photographs, the ones that the historical societies promote in the 1880s, 1890s, the late 1800s. And we're told after the industrial age has reached these cities and after the cities are built out with steel and rail lines, that's when we begin to see photographs that show the people and show all of this new construction. And yet the new construction appears the exact same as the old construction, only renovated, only additions added, little steel ornamentations and things like that. But basically, we're looking at the same city, just finally occupied. And that's what it appears like, in my opinion. And yet the historians of these cities will tell us that's simply not the case. The photography of the 1850s wasn't good enough to photograph all of the people in the city. And yet by the 1870s, we see the exact same city with the exact same architecture, but we're told everything's new besides the people. How interesting is that? By all accounts, something happened in our timeline. And when I say our, I mean the timeline of the world, the currently accepted timeline. Something happened in this timeline where an established and dignified country, or some would call it a unified group of people, were removed from maps and encyclopedias shortly after Peter the Great comes to power in what is today Russia. However, this Russian Renaissance, mixed with the later Industrial Revolution of Russia and the rest of the world, these appear to go hand in hand with the erasing of this substantial culture. I'm talking, of course, about Tartary or Tartaria, the Tartarians. Now, regarding just a sliver of their once immense population, in my belief, the land on maps labeled as Tartary or Tartaria in northern Russia represented more of a smaller headquarters for a larger ancient group of people, just as the Vatican City represents the church and Washington, D.C. represents the American government. I believe the lands in northern Russia labeled as Tartary or Tartaria represented a larger Tartarian kingdom, which really at one point or another had its hold over the world, or at least had its hold over the architectural construction that would go into each and every major city of the world. I think the best metaphor for what Tartary could have represented is the land of Rome, Italy. You could be in parts of Rome and you could have never actually visited Rome, Italy, or the capital of the Roman Empire. However, you could be the whole way in Africa or in far northern Europe or in other stretches of the world and still be considered yourself a Roman, having never set foot in Italy once in your life. And I find that to be very interesting, but also a great metaphor for just what Tartary could have been. You could have these amalgamations of people that were labeled as Tartarians, and you could also have the kingdoms or the largest castles, or maybe even the headquarters for where this antiquitech operated, and that could have been located in the ancient lands in northern Russia. This was a sort of headquarters for the operation, a headquarters for the first men, a headquarters for the architecture of the old world to stem out of. This is where the kings of kings resided. However, the rest of the world still could have been under a Tartarian influence. And that may be what we see on these earlier maps that depict Tartary growing and growing in the 16th and 17th centuries, and yet we really don't read a lot about Tartary in any of the old books or encyclopedias, almost as if the history of this Tartarian land was wiped away, or by the 16th and 17th centuries, the idea of Tartary was just that, more of an idea, more of a belief, a way of life, than it was necessarily a land with borders and regions. What if these first men, hypothetically from Tartary, the first to conquer language, to conquer religion, to conquer proto-mathematics, to conquer the communication necessary to facilitate teaching, what if these first men, like patient zero for a plague, the first small pocket of these men, the first to learn the concepts that would go on to define society, what if these first men, not subjugating, but instead teaching, would go about and share this information with their neighbor? Thus, the beliefs and the good nature and the proto-language and the proto-religion were started in an area, but quickly spread and spread and spread until all parts of the world, all human beings, thus had the ability to think and to do minimal mathematics and to at least communicate with one another in some minuscule sense. What if this knowledge would eventually become what shaped society? Wouldn't it be important if all of this came from northern India, from Russia, from an area once known as Tartary? With this ability to count, to reason, to know, came the ability then for others to contradict and to deceive. Thus, the necessity for kingdoms and for borders was born from this knowledge of the first men. But this was not before the initial knowledge of mathematics, of language, of some sort of belief in a higher power had reached the whole of the world. At some point in this lineage, much later, the Abrahamic religions came along and they rewrote the ancient knowledge, substantially censoring what came from the Babylonians and the Zoroastrians, and these original concepts which made men men. Again, I believe this was a long drawn process, but we have evidence that the architecture not only fits the bill of these proto-religions of the first men of Tartary when it comes to similarities that were beyond mere coincidence in these buildings found on all corners of the earth, but these same structures worldwide also incorporate something we call Antiquitech. The real issue is explaining what the Antiquitech is, recreating the technology that was lost, and dumbing it down for the masses who have never had exposure to Tartary at all. We look at these great sites, the Celtic sites, indigenous American sites, and especially ancient regions of Asia, including the very capital of Beijing, once known as Peking, and before that, known simply as the Forbidden City and the Forbidden Palace. And we see the same architecture, the same exact geometric patterns, reinforced by seemingly endless retaining walls made of brick. It's in Beijing, it's in India, it comes from Tartary. So much so that the capital of Beijing, this capital building, the Forbidden Palace, all of the walls that seem to surround the palace, we have walls that look like they're in the middle of nowhere, where the landscape is barren and dry. And we look and we have walls nearly 100 feet tall that are stretching as far as the eye can see. The lens of the camera captures as far as it can, and beyond that, there is still more wall. All of this wall stretches all around the kingdom, all around the ancient, the forbidden city in Beijing. This forbidden city is encompassed by this Tartarian wall. Now, it's not just me labeling this wall as Tartarian. We have photographs from the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s, which I'm showing you in this video. And in every single one, you have this labeled as the, quote, Tartarian wall, the Tartar wall, the Tartar palace, the Tartar fort. And you can see it's all different parts of the fort. It's not just one little location as it's labeled today that is the Tartar wall in Beijing. It was once the entire wall that seemed to surround the city, and the palace itself all had these Tartar labels that were put on them. They were Tartarian. And back then, especially in this Chinese history and the history of Asia itself, Tartar was used much as a slanderous term. At least that's what we're told by the Europeans who came in and labeled it that way. However, it appears in ancient China, in ancient Asian cultures, to be Tartarian was actually much of a blessing. It was a term of endearment to show where your people came from and the ability that your people had to construct this massive architecture. And yet, as we look through all the earliest pictures of the Great Wall, of the Tartar Wall, there's nothing that surrounds it, nothing that would indicate how the wall was built, who preserves the structure, who maintains it, who even occupies it at the time of these photographs. Sure, we have the narrative that's given below the photograph saying, well, this is the Tartarian Wall, this is the Tartarian Palace, but within the image, we see a seemingly impossibly large city wall that runs for miles. And at the apex and within the walls at specified locations, we see multiple towers and castles all sitting empty for the photographing. Then we look at the architecture down to these dimensions, down to the entrances, to the domes, to the archways, and it appears very much the same as India, very much the same as other cities that would have fallen into the ancient reign of Tartary. It's the same in Europe. It's the same as America. It's the same as Africa. Is it Moorish? Is it Celtic? Is it Old World? It's whatever moniker you'd like to place on it. Because in the end, it's all so very similar that to deduce or to give credit to one modern understanding of one nation is to discredit the hidden history, to discredit the nations of our past that have amalgamated into something more. Many argue in the comments of my videos about whether a specific object or structure bears one history or another. And I think our history was told to us that way purposefully. As I stated earlier, the names are often convoluted of the same people, the same structures, and their architectural styles are given different names through different time periods, yet the photographs show us that the buildings all adhere very much to the same exact principles. We see history which states that much of Africa was destroyed by infighting and disturbances after the Berbers of North Africa began to lose power. Yet the history of the destruction actually seems to trace back to bankers and the rich dynasties like Mansa Musa, who subjugated his own people and allowed foreigners to conquer his land for a fee. Follow the money, if you will, and you'll begin to pull at larger threads, no matter what history you're reading about. Rothschilds, Europe, the amalgamation of kingdoms, rich in history, to countries, all part of a greater worldwide union. Is the European Union a new world order or an old world order? Then we have the Carnegies and the Morgans of the world, the men who bought museums under the auspices of figuring out the true history of mankind. Yet, in doing so, these same men actually displaced forts and burial mounds and things of that nature in the Americas, in Europe and Africa, hiding and rebranding artifacts which appeared to go against the new narrative, the currently accepted narrative. Then we have elite social groups and the richest of men who sought the same knowledge that we do today, but these men appeared to want to covet this knowledge before allowing it to ever reach the public. And still, throughout all the hysteria of the 16th, 17th, 18th, even the 19th century, it appears the Tartarian nation, however small it actually became, whatever group that they really were, somehow survived into the early 1800s. For centuries, we have stories of heroes, the men who fought to protect knowledge from the greedy and to share the spoils of war with the people who deserved it. Then we have centuries of history, which does away with classical warfare for orchestrated warfare. We have steam-powered technology, which smacks the public like a sack of potatoes, culminating in steam-powered super tools and steam-powered locomotives, steam-powered engines, all of which were put to use immediately worldwide in every inch of the earth to construct railway tunnels and lines, which all interconnected within a span of roughly 45 years, and this occurred nearly worldwide. Imagine, if you will, just as a thought experiment, trying to nowadays lay a train track that would go across whatever city you are in right now. A train track that would be across a path that doesn't already exist. So we're not talking about covering up a road and putting in a train track. We're talking about making a new path directly across the city. So knocking down buildings or moving land, moving structures, basically making way for this train track. How long do you think that would take, and how much time and money and resources do you think would have to go into a project of that nature? Would it take more than a month? More than 2 months? I know in my city, I can imagine it might take over a year. And yet we're told in the mid-1800s that not only did this happen really in every city across the world, but we're told that it happened to the point that these railroads were actually extended to connect to one another. For the most part, we're told these railroads went through uncharted areas, unmapped areas, and they were connected in an industrial age with brand new technologies, a brand new steam-powered railway, a brand new railroad line, a brand new idea that we could travel by rail lines within 40 to 50 years. Every major city had enough people in the city, enough educated workers to go out of their way, connecting for hundreds of thousands of miles, railroad lines that interconnected the greater countries of the world. And all this was done seemingly undocumented, unphotographed, without any sort of evidence of how it occurred. And at the same time, this brand new technology that seemingly took over the world was also being pushed during a revolution, an industrial revolution, which also had millions of other inventions and other feats of engineering and ingenuity that were taken to the forefront at the same time. Meaning, we had enough skilled and educated workers to not only construct railway lines around the better part of the world, but at the same time, they had millions of other ingenuities that were being utilized, from the camera to the bridge making technologies, to the road making, to the automobile, to the trolleys, to the underground subway tunnels, etc., etc., etc. Everything that we label as Tartaria, or we label as questionable, or we label as some sort of ancient technology. And then we're told that all of this arose in 50 years or less, and we don't have any photography. We don't have any evidence. We don't have any proof of how it happened. All we have is a historical narrative that tells us, believe us, it's the truth. So what do you think? How was this all created? Is it all Tartarian? Or are you on the other side of the argument here, the mainstream side of the argument, as we'll call it? I'm just here to look at both sides and see what sort of evidence we have. But can you make an argument for how in 50 years, all the major cities of the world, not just America, but of the world, had the ability to construct railway lines? They had the ability to photograph their land for the first time. They had the ability to construct massive castles, and beyond that, they had the ability to supply their cities with clean water, with aquifers, with other inventions that appeared to come to us from Roman times. And yet, as you look at these cities, not only were the inventions or the antiquitech seemingly dated from an earlier society, but the construction itself. In many of these cities, no matter where you are around the world, this antiquitech was often incorporated with old red brick construction. And yet, none of these cities will tell us that these infrastructures were already there. They will tell us that these are all new creations, a 50-year timeline worldwide to interconnect every major city and every major technology. Is it possible? Is it something that was done, or is it something that was inherited? Let me know what you believe down below. And just to wrap it up, or just to put a ribbon on it, so to speak, to take it one step further, I'll chime out with my narrative, and you can just see what I see in these old photographs. I labeled all these to incorporate some sort of antiquitech, or to be reminiscent of this Tartarian empire, so hopefully you understand why I labeled them as such. But anyway, to get back to my idea here, to wrap it up real quick, we're told by 1880 in many of these major cities, the same lines that were being used as railway lines, so many of these lines were brand new, especially in a historical context. We're talking about maybe 20 years old or less, so that is relatively new when we're looking at, thousands of years of history, we're told that these same early railway lines that were really cutting edge at the time to connect all of these areas to make the route able to be traversed by these railroads. We then have the idea of electrifying these experiments, and we actually have evidence of electrified railways in nearly every major city, especially the major cities of America. We often see that these projects were coming to fruition really around the world, and we even have documented cases where they were actually built and that history was allowed to come to the forefront, meaning we have published works from that time period that are still available today that go into detail about how these electrified railway lines were being applied to all of these major cities. And yet, one thing we come to find is roughly by the year 1900, I'd say definitively by the year 1915, we have all of these electric railway lines being abandoned, or the idea to electrify rail lines, to make them free and electric. These were abandoned. Really, it goes against the initial concept anyway, but that just makes you question, what is all of this? What is the world? What is the Antiquitech? What is the message of the past that we are not seeing? Is it all a massive coincidence? I don't believe in coincidences.